Welcome back. You're listening to Praxologie, the podcast where theology fuels the mission of the church. We're helping leaders to think biblically, to reflect theologically, and to act missionally. My name is Kilian Spies. I'm a missionary with Josiah Venture, and we do research that increases the quality of disciple making, and we're partnering with Morelands College to facilitate a BA program to build up the next generation of Christian leaders in Central and Eastern Europe. As you know, this season is all about navigating young people's faith formation, which is just a fancy word of saying discipleship. And today, Sean is not with us, but I have my fearless team leader with me. Long-time listeners know him very well. He's the master of coffee beans and books. He's well-read, not just in the works of J.R.R. Tolkien, but also, in some people might say less important topics, such as conversations in the Old Testament. No, I'm kidding. It's important, sort of. We'll hear about that in a second. But welcome back, Tyler Petty.
Thank you. It's been a long time. I'm glad to be back on the show.
How are you doing today?
Doing very well. Yeah. You mentioned J.R.R. Tolkien. I got a new Tolkien book for Christmas, and I'm very much enjoying reading it. It's by a medieval historian, and it looks at the kind of historical and literary sources that inspired Tolkien to write his Middle-earth masterpiece. So
nice.
Very, very fun.
I thought it was a book by him, but it's about him, right?
It's about him. Mm-hmm.
It's about him. Okay. Oh, you're such a fan. You are reading books about the author. Nice.
It's true.
Great. Cool. As I said, Tyler, you're an expert in many fields, not just Lord of the Rings or coffee, but you're writing your PhD thesis, right? You're analyzing conversations people had in the Old Testament. I feel like it's a bit like reading other people's text messages, isn't it? And what are you trying to find out?
It's very much like reading people's text messages. Conversations are something that is a phenomenon that is consistent throughout all cultures and times. You can have conversations with anyone, anywhere, at any time. And that's why when we read stories in the Old Testament where there are conversations, it feels familiar. So think about Moses and God at the burning bush, or Samuel and Eli trying to figure out who's talking to who as he's waking up in the middle of the night, or Jesus having conversations with his disciples. These happened thousands of years ago, and yet they feel so familiar. So conversations are really ubiquitous, or they're the same across all cultures. But the way that you do conversations is different from culture to culture. And in that sense, it's very much like text messages, or maybe using emojis. I was from a generation where giving the thumbs up emoji was a good response, right? It's like you give a thumbs up, and that means great. But Kilian, apparently that's not what thumbs up means anymore. What does thumbs up mean?
Well, I'm a zillennial, so between millennial and Gen Z. But apparently, the generation of my parents, or it's perceived by the younger generation that the generation of our parents use the thumbs up as a way to say, oh, I've read this, but I'm not emotionally invested. That's what it feels like. It's like a thumbs up. Oh, okay. But a laughing emoji would have been good as well, or something like congrats, not just a thumbs up, but yeah.
There you go. So one simple response can mean lots of different things. And so it's very much the same when in conversations in the Old Testament. We can read them and they might look familiar. We might say, oh yeah, I know what a thumbs up means. I know what that kind of response means, but we may be misinterpreting it because it was recorded from a different culture. So that's what my dissertation is exploring.
Oh, very, very interesting. I feel like this has a lot of potential to sort of reform our understanding of the Old Testament and of the theology of the Old Testament. Yeah. So
I do. I
listeners,
agree. Yeah.
definitely something to look out for once it's done. Um, do you have a timeline? An expected timeline?
I do. I'm hoping to submit the dissertation this spring, so spring 2026. And
Wow.
then I'll be working shortly after that on putting it into a book form. So, like you said, it can be a resource for people who are studying Old Testament narratives and who want to read the Bible better.
So cool. So excited to read them myself one day. So one issue I feel like people run into when we're talking. My English is not Englishing yet this new year. But one issue we run into when discipling young people, um, and especially when we're talking about the Old Testament, it feels like when they're at the point where they read Old Testament stories, right? When you're discipling someone and you've read maybe, I don't know, Luke and Acts, and then a couple of the letters, and then you go into the Old Testament stories. Um, I've actually talked about this with my small group a couple of weeks ago. It's like God seems to be different, or at least he seems to act differently in the Old Testament than he does in the New Testament. Um, so somewhat it feels like God's character has evolved, um, but that doesn't quite feel right, right? And or is it our understanding of God that has changed? How we view God and how He is described in the text of the Old Testament is it differently than in the New Testament? Um, and then a question that comes from that is how reliable is the Bible when God is portrayed differently in the Old Testament compared to the New Testament? Do you have any experience in that?
It's a question I've thought about a lot. I really love the Old Testament, and one of the reasons I fell in love with the Old Testament is because of its portrayal of God. I was not a big Bible reader growing up, and in college, I finally started to read the Old Testament and had a great teacher who really made it come alive and really showed me through the reading how amazing God is in these stories, how faithful He is, how gracious He is, how kind, but also how much of a good thing it is that He is just and that He fights on behalf of the weak and the vulnerable. So I love going to the Old Testament and the New Testament for its portrayal of God. And yet, for sure, as you say, there are things that are shocking and confusing
Yeah.
to many of us as we read the Old Testament, and I would argue also the New Testament. Just think about Revelation and swords coming out of Jesus's mouth, or Jesus's statements that He's not come to bring peace but the sword, and to create to separate family members from each other. There's shocking things in the whole Bible, but maybe more so in the Old Testament because the culture is so different from ours, and so we often don't know how to read it and how to understand it. So it's a big question. I would say God's character is very complex, and in terms of how the Old Testament is put together, there are books that highlight some parts of God's character more than others, and so it's like this mosaic where there's not every book paints the whole picture of God. That could be a helpful framework as we look at texts, or even think about New Testament texts that, for example, really emphasize the forgiveness of God. And so that's one piece of the mosaic that's really, really important, that's being highlighted in a book like maybe one of the Gospels. if you look at Exodus, for example, the thing that is trying to be highlighted there is God's power. Kind of like what I said, that, it is a good thing that God fights on behalf of the vulnerable, and that he doesn't let wickedness and evil and sin spread infinitely. But there's also lots of redemption that happens in that as well, and there's good news there, but it looks a little bit different. So that could be confusing if you go to a book like Exodus and you expect God to just be really nice and kind, but it's not appropriate because his people are in slavery. He has to go
Right.
and save them.
Yeah.
And he can't save them by coming and saying, "Pretty please, Pharaoh, could you be so kind as..." Well, actually, he does in a way. He sends Moses to try and negotiate with him, and is super gracious. Okay, we'll try again. We'll try again. We will. Here's another sign. Here's another warning. But finally, it reaches a point where it's too much. So there's other books that highlight different aspects as well, like Ezekiel really highlights God's holiness and his otherness. But other books like Hosea really highlight God's closeness and his desire to be close to people and to have a relationship with people. So we need to read the whole Bible and put together this mosaic, and not just read one part, even if that's just the New Testament. I think we need the Old Testament to have a full picture of God.
Yeah. That's a very helpful framework to use. That each book highlights a different aspect of God's character, and even the New Testament doesn't give us a full picture of God. Yeah, that's super helpful. We could stop there. We could talk more about this, but I want to move on to discipleship. How, like, I think the question I want to answer this episode is, how can we faithfully read the Old Testament to grow ourselves, and how can we help others to read the Old Testament to grow in their faith? Maybe we can look at some scriptures. Maybe you have a few examples of a few stories of success where you've read it and grown, or others have read it and grown. I definitely have, and have a story in mind from an experience I had with you actually together.
Oh, okay. I'm curious.
And yeah.
That's great.
What are some ways to read the Old Testament to engage in that faith formation?
That's great. There's some kind of maybe more thinking that we can do about this question, and then I have some very practical advice as well. But let's do the thinking first, because that's kind of fun. So it really, we started kind of with setting the right expectations when we come to read, and I think that's a great place to start, even with the students that we're discipling, or young people, or whoever we're discipling, is to help them have the right expectations. And one basic expectation that people should have is that the Bible is really good at telling us the most important things about God and salvation, and making those very clear. But then the other things, there's a bunch of things that are not clear, that might be confusing, that might be troubling, and that's okay. That's normal. That's actually part of communication. Is that you have to work to understand. You have to work to be patient, to be gracious, to expect the best of the person who's communicating to you, and not assume that you know what the other person's going to say. So it'd be like if I cut you off halfway while you're talking, Kilian, and said, I already know what you're going to say. You don't need to finish your thought. That's not very nice, right? So we need to have the right expectations that we don't know. We don't know everything, and we need to be curious There's going to be some things that are super clear and encouraging, and there will be other things that will be confusing. And that's part of the process of growing, actually. And that brings to mind for me an example in, especially an example of this kind of wrestling that happens in an example in Proverbs. So Proverbs is, and the other wisdom literature is all about trying to help us to be wiser people, to know how to navigate the world that God has created, and live in a way that shows God's goodness to others. And there's lots of good advice here about, how you can make good decisions and how to navigate the world. But not everything is very clear. And a great example is Proverbs chapter 26, starting in verse 4, which says, "Do not answer a fool according to his folly, or you will be like him yourself." So if someone's foolish, if someone's being like, it wants to just fight, have a verbal fight with you, it's like if somebody writes something provocative on Facebook, don't respond, because then you'll become like him. Yeah.
Don't feed the trolls.
Don't feed the trolls. Exactly. Okay. Seems pretty clear, right? Okay. Wait, great. That's pretty straightforward. But then you read the next verse and it says, "Answer a fool according to his folly, or he will be wise in his own eyes." So the very next verse says, actually, you should respond to the trolls, because if you don't, they'll think that they have all the answers. So it's two verses right next to each other that seem to contradict one another. Yeah. And so what do we do in a situation like this? There's plenty of other examples like this in the Bible where it seems like, wait, that doesn't make sense. But I think the point is that it's inviting us to reflect on, and reflect more and think, well, okay, but if both of those are true, then how do I live that out? There might be some circumstances where I do need to hold my tongue and not feed the trolls. And there are other times where I do need to speak up and be bold and say, no, you're wrong. And that is part of our formation. So we're talking about discipleship, faith formation. A huge part of formation is developing wisdom and knowing when it's appropriate to speak up, when it's more appropriate to not speak, when it's appropriate to do this or that, or to withhold. And in all these sorts of moments of tension in the Bible, invite us to ask God what he thinks, and to pray and to ask his wisdom. So wrestling is baked into the Old Testament. Wrestling with the Bible is part of how the Old Testament works to form people.
Nice. I like that. You said a huge part of formation is developing wisdom. That's so cool. We've been talking about different, like in the very beginning of this series. We've been talking about different ways to understand discipleship, and I feel like nowadays we've landed more on a therapeutical way to do discipleship. Someone, if you disciple someone, you sort of answer their questions, but it should also be more practical. But that way, if we think about discipleship through that lens, then developing wisdom is a big part of it, right? You go to a therapist to develop some skills to deal with the situation, or with emotions, to build up mechanisms, and I feel like that's part of it, part of discipleship, to develop wisdom. And we as discipler, is that a thing?
It is, yeah.
Discipler are called to not just to pass on wisdom, but to help others to grow in their wisdom, and to help others to to step into the wisdom that God has, all in step with the Spirit. Yeah, that's a great point, that the Old Testament helps us to develop that wisdom, and especially if we're looking at the overarching story of it, and not just the wisdom literature can help us a lot with it, but also the overarching story.
Yes,
of,
some scholars have even said that the whole of the Bible is kind of framed by wisdom. When we look at how Proverbs talks about creation, it talks about it being established in wisdom, and so God has set up the whole world for our formation, and He's inviting us to explore it and learn how to navigate it, so that we are more in tune with the ways that He has set up the world. And so, if the story of the Bible starts with creation and ends with new creation, then we could see that part of our journey from original creation to new creation is growing in wisdom in this world that God has made. And sometimes it can be frustrating, though, because, like you said, you might go to a therapist for some advice, some help, some good ideas, but often wisdom says two things. It says both things, like in our example in Proverbs, and it invites us to wrestle with it. And it actually reminds me of a quote from The Lord of the Rings. So here we go, where Frodo says, "Go not to the elves for counsel, for they will answer both no and yes." So the elves are in Tolkien's universe are the epitome of the wise, because they were the first created, and they've been inhabiting the world for the longest. They don't die, so they're super wise. But when you go to them for wisdom, you kind of get both sides. Well, it could be this, and it could be this. And that's very frustrating. But the benefit of that is that when done well, now we're going back to the discipleship. When done well, you can help your disciple to own their journey for themselves, and really ask God for wisdom, and then step out in faith rather than depending on the advice of others.
Mm-hmm. For sure. Yeah.
Do you want another example?
You said there are
from. Go ahead.
You said yes. Let's dive into another example.
Okay. So this is one that actually I studied for my dissertation. So it's in 2 Kings. A very strange interaction between Elijah and Elisha. Let's see. Oh, it's actually First Kings. 1 Kings 19, I believe. 19 or 20. There we go. At the end of chapter 19. So 1 Kings 19. So this is one that a passage that I studied for my dissertation, because it's a very strange interaction. It does not make sense at first, but I think it does illustrate what we're talking about really, really well. So let me go ahead and read it. It's very short. 1 Kings 19, verses 19 through 21. So Elijah went from there and found Elisha, son of Shaphat. He was plowing with 12 yoke of oxen, and he himself was driving the 12th pair. Elijah went up to him and threw his cloak around him. Elisha then left his oxen and ran after Elijah. "Let me kiss my father and mother goodbye," he said, "and then I will come with you." "Go back," Elijah replied. "What have I done to you?" So Elisha left him and went back. He took his yoke of oxen and slaughtered them. He burned the plowing equipment to cook the meat and gave it to the people, and they ate. Then he set out to follow Elijah and became his attendant. So this is the moment when Elisha is anointed, or is kind of not anointed, but he's given the responsibility to take over Elijah's ministry. But it's done in a really weird way. God had already told Elijah to go find this dude in the verses before, and this is after Elijah's experience of depression and being out in the wilderness, and God meeting him in the still voice. But he doesn't seem very excited, right? Elijah just shows up, throws his cloak over Elisha, and then walks away. And then when Elisha runs after him, he's like, "Wait, what should I do? Can I go say goodbye? What's okay?" He understands that there's something happening here where he's being commissioned, but he doesn't know what Elijah wants from him, really. And Elijah's response is like, I don't know. He basically says, do whatever you want. What have I done to you? And some scholars think that this is a sign of Elijah's ongoing depression, that he's kind of resigned from, he's like given up basically on his ministry, and he really doesn't care. It's possible that there's a little bit of that going on. But what also could be going on is that Elijah knows that that Elisha needs to own this decision for himself. He can't tell him what to do forever because he's not going to be around forever. And so his response could be an invitation to wisdom, to saying, what do you think is appropriate? If you understood that I'm calling you to take over my ministry, what do you think is appropriate here? To go back and say goodbye and clean up your affairs, and then join me later, or burn the oxen, like cut off your past and follow me fully. And that's ultimately what he does. But it's the first step in Elisha really learning to walk with God for himself. And Elisha, in many ways, becomes an even greater prophet than Elijah does. He gets a double portion of Elijah's spirit, and then does probably even greater things than Elijah. But he wouldn't have been able to do that, I don't think, without an experience like this, where he was challenged to wrestle with what is appropriate for right now, and how do I make a good decision based on the information that I have, and based on the calling that God has placed on my life. So I think we can do very similar things with our students. We can bring them to the scriptures, bring them to difficult Old Testament stories, and say, all right, what do you think is going on? And you can, you don't have to be silent. Like Elijah wasn't silent forever. He did give him a little bit of information, but he also encouraged his disciple to wrestle for himself. And that's something we can certainly do, especially with Old Testament stories, because there are a number that encourage wrestling and then produce, hopefully, richer transformation because of that.
Yeah. And I like that you said that Elisha basically had to figure out what it looks like for himself. That Elijah, the older guy, was there, and sort of gave him an initial invitation, but Elisha, he had to work out for himself what it means to first follow God, and follow in the ways of the ministry, but also how to step into it. I feel like we can be there for people we disciple, and but it's only really fruitful if they've incorporated things for themselves. I remember one of our students said that she produced disciples that looked a lot like her, and in the end, they turned out to have very similar problems, very similar issues than she had, and their faith wasn't as deep as it could be. And then she encouraged her disciples to grow and explore for themselves. And she started to ask more questions than present answers. And turns out the faith of her disciples grew stronger and deeper than even her own. So yeah, that's really cool. And it's it's encouraging that our discipleship journeys are very individual. But it's it's always a wrestling process, as you said. Yeah,
Absolutely. Yeah. We've done some thinking. Do you want to look at some practical advice now? We do.
Yeah, for sure. Let's go.
Yeah. So I think we've already started going in that direction. So I do think that the Old Testament is really important for discipleship. I hope that I made that clear already. And I mean, very, very practically, I think we can do a much better job of encouraging students to read the Old Testament. The maybe not in a Bible reading plan, like from start to finish, but certainly by pointing them to really important stories. That's one of the gifts of the Old Testament, is how many stories it has. And those stories are not given to us to show us how to do things always, like, or how to, the best way to do things. Often they're stories of failure, and the stories that highlight mistakes and really our need for God and His grace and forgiveness. And so we can point them to those key stories and encourage them to wrestle with them. I mean, some of the foundational stories that I think every Christian should know is certainly the creation story, Genesis 1-3, certainly the Exodus story, which is in the first 15 chapters or so, 16 chapters of Exodus. The stories of King David and God's covenant with David are really, really important, and even the stories of his own failure are actually really, really important. Whether it's his sin with Bathsheba, or the fracturing of his family and the fracturing of the kingdom, and of course, even some going to these prophetic stories from First Kings and Second Kings, also super important to get to know Elijah and Elisha and see how they wrestled and also stayed faithful to God in the midst of a time period where which was very hostile towards people, men and women of faith. That can be really encouraging. I think the stories of Daniel as well, Daniel and his friends being faithful in exile when really they lost all of their sense of identity in their home. Super important, especially for young people in Central and Eastern Europe, who are in the minority in their faith, who stand out just by virtue of believing in God. Many, many more. But stories are a great way for people to get into the Old Testament. And then I think it's always great to just talk about them. You can do so much with kind of reading closely, but then imagining, oh, well, what would you do in this situation? Would you do any better? Probably not. Or what sort of a parallel situation could we find today, and how can that help us live a life of faith better? There's so much. There's more that I could say, but I think that's a good first step for discipling young people. And the main reason is that back to where we started. I think getting to know God from different angles helps make our faith more robust, stronger. So that when challenges come, or when we experience hardship, we're ready for it. We know that God is both kind and gracious, and also will discipline us, and allows us to go through testing but it will always, remain loyal and faithful to his promises and all that.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. Maybe one last Bible story that fits here. A couple of years ago, me and my class, we were reading the story of Hagar in Genesis 16. And I've read this story before, and I sort of knew it, and it was about to be, I think, the verse of the year for the German evangelical church. So I was, familiar with the storyline. And then we read it in class, and we read it in depth, and we spent quite some time on it. Not just, well, first of all, reading it and immersing ourselves into it. And then we discussed, I think it was the whole class that discussed, and it was such a great time. And you know the story that God has promised Abraham, that he will have many children, many descendants. He and Sarai try to make some, nothing works. So they find a solution, the servant Hagar, and she immediately becomes pregnant, delivers a baby, and then Abraham and Sarah, somewhat together, throw out of the camp into the wilderness, and then the angel of the Lord meets her and tells her to go back into that somewhat abusive relationship, somewhat still the promise of God. And in that, she says, "Oh, you are a God who sees me." And I've been so confused by the overall storyline. And I was like, if that is God's plan, that's crazy. But that verse in the midst of that has just really changed my perspective on the story. And it's been something that I've been wrestling and thinking about ever since, that God is a God who sees us. So that's been really transformational for me, and gave me some more wisdom. So yeah, just an encouragement to read the story multiple times, and to really look out for the details in there. And even though as you said earlier, the stories are not always a blueprint for our lives.
No.
It shouldn't always be a blueprint for our lives, but we can learn a lot from them about God's character. Yeah. Anything you want to add to end this episode?
This has been really fun. I hope that our listeners are encouraged to read more of the Old Testament, and even with your great example, the command for Hagar to go back into a potentially abusive situation still doesn't really make sense. But that's okay. That's part of the story. Is that we're supposed to be like, wait, why? But ultimately, the point is that somehow Hagar felt seen even in the midst of the hardship and the confusion and the trouble, and that's what we should be taking away. So even if you read the Old Testament and still have questions, that's fine. That's totally okay. Focus on the things that are clear, especially about God's character.
Mm-hmm. That's a great way to end this episode. Thank you for tuning in. Thank you, Tyler, for coming back.
Thank you so much for having me.
It's always such a pleasure to talk with you. Old Testament stories. Read other people's text messages. Listeners, we hope you're encouraged to read more of the Old Testament, to engage more deeply with it, and to lead others more into the stories of the Old Testament, and to wrestle together with them. We pray that you would develop wisdom in your path of faith formation, and as you pass this on, that you'll be guided by the Spirit. Until next time.
Thanks so much.